We are live with another session of .NET API reviews. We have a small agenda that we're hoping to get through today, and then we are really hoping we're going to get to the general backlog, though recent trend says we're probably not actually going to. All right. So make sync SSL stream authenticate as overload with SSL options public 34638.
Okay, I suppose I should start. This is a follow-up for work on HTTP client sync API. And this API proposal wants to make an existing method which is private public. And the method is the authenticate as client, SSL client authentication options one. And this method in its asynchronous version already is public. And we want to expose the private version as well in order to use it in our sync HTTP client API. Also, the SSL stream already has synchronous methods for authentication, which, however, do not support the SSL client authentication options and SSL server authentication options on the server side.
So there are options that are not currently exposed in the existing overloads.
So this is, we have the authenticate as client synchronous methods, which didn't get the new options class, but then the async version did.
Yeah, exactly.
And then same thing with the authenticated server.
Yeah.
And I assume client options, or the client authentication options, include the target host parameter.
Yes.
It includes all of the parameters that are in the existing overloads, and then one or two more.
Okay, so ultimately this is just making the synchronous, this and this synchronous version of these two async methods.
Yep, just giving it parity.
Okay.
That's Maya said we already use it internally, so all the synchronous methods actually would create internally the option bag and call the function. They just not public.
Right. Does anybody have any objections?
Seems pretty straightforward.
Done.
Thank you. That was easy.
Super easy.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Requires unreferenced code attribute 33862.
I expect we will talk a lot about naming, and I wish that Imo was here. Did he join, or I can see him in the list? Because it seems like there is a big overlap with his capabilities attributes proposal, which is kind of a more general purpose version of this. Basically, what we would like to add is ability to annotate code with something that tells linker that code that is behind this annotation is kind of not interesting to analyze. Kind of the problem with linker is that linker tries to find unused code in your app. In .NET 5, we are adding a way how to kind of make linker see through more of the reflection patterns that people can have that are really difficult to analyze to kind of find unused code. But there will still be many reflection patterns that people use that are not possible to analyze. So kind of there are valid use cases for people to use reflection in a way that linker will not be able to analyze it. And if people turn on linker on that, they would get a huge amount of warnings about like, oh, like there is some reflection that I cannot figure out. And it wouldn't really be actionable for them to kind of go through those warnings and kind of scratch their heads about like, oh, what can I do with this? What we would like to be able to do is just for library authors to place something on either their library or specific methods within the library that tells the linker that, hey, like here I am going to do crazy amount of reflection. If someone uses this with IL linker, please give them this warning message that is right there. And the warning message could be something like, hey, you are trying to use a feature that this library has, and this feature is really dynamic. Like you are trying to, for example, you have a serializer, and there are some like these unsecure serializers that kind of let you have type name in the payload, and they will just go and look up the type somewhere and kind of try to deserialize it. And this is really difficult to analyze statically because kind of you don't know what the payload will be. So kind of the library author will be able to annotate that like, oh, here I have the API that can do this crazy unsecure deserialization. But if someone tries to use it with linker, then like just give them a warning because it will not work. And kind of the bigger picture is that eventually in the linker space, we would like to extend this further. So the question will be whether we want like specific attributes or kind of a general purpose attribute, because we would like to also be able to find code that is single file unfriendly, for example. Like there are APIs even within framework that are unfriendly for single file compilation. For example, if you have assembly.location API, you call that, but you are a single file compilation. What is really the location that this API should return? And the third thing that we would like to think about in the linker space is detection of AOT unfriendly patterns, and that would be like I don't know, reflection emit or like whatever thing that kind of uses a lot of JIT. So that's just something to consider when we are reviewing this, whether we would like something more general purpose or just like single specific purpose thing. I don't know if I summed it up well.
Okay, so this would be used any method that ends up using reflection, or is there something kind of more specific?
This would be potentially you can even put it on a constructor of some class that kind of once you instantiate it, it's going to do stuff that is difficult to analyze. Kind of in .NET 5, we would like linker to be able to give you actionable warnings if there is some reflection use that couldn't be reasoned about statically. But those warnings will be basically like, hey, you are calling this API from this location, and like I don't know what the system type is that you are using. And that might not be too actionable if you get this warning within a NuGet library. So kind of this is kind of meant for maybe library authors that if they run the linker tooling on their library and they find like here you have reflection patterns that are difficult to analyze, you can put this attribute on it and then we will no longer analyze it, but whoever calls these APIs will get a warning if they are trimming.
Can I try and parrot this back to you? Basically, without this, someone's going to run the linker on my library and they're going to get some errors which may or may not be intelligible to them. And I can improve the experience for them by instead putting this attribute on the relevant method in order to give them a crafted message that will make their life better. Is that right?
Yes.
Ideally, the message would include some recommendation as to like what to do about it, right? Maybe use a different API, maybe, you know, whatever. Maybe use some kind of a code-gen solution. But there will be a lot of cases where there's just no solution. That's also, you know.
Would it be useful to have a URL? Because in almost all other cases where we want to provide guidance, a string-based approach only allows you to do so much. Very often you want to point people to an actual document that they can read. And yes, you can put a URL in that message, but depending on how you're using the attribute, you might find that you don't want to be in the business of auto-generating, some sort of like URL detection mechanism or something. So would it be useful to just have a URL property here that you can set, initialize, and then the link or whatever produces that message can automatically include the URL if it's set?
We do expect to use URLs there for like some of even other stuff. Do I understand correctly that the proposal is that we would have both message and URL? Because for some, URL will not be a good solution, right? They probably want, if I'm a random NuGet author, I might not want to put a URL there because it's just too much hassle.
Right. I mean, that's why usually the way I would do it, I would have message and I would have URL, and it can be set both or neither, right?
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
It just means that if you have a URL and it's in the URL, then you know that you should render that if it's present as a URL, not as a text, right?
So let's say I use this in my library and I make a recommendation for how the consumer can actually make their code safe. What does the user then do? Like, how do they get this to stop warning?
So either not use the API or the attribute we discussed last week, which is the unconditional suppress message, would be able to suppress this.
I see.
So would one of these error messages that this would pop up, is this something that like the user is definitely doing the wrong thing here? Or are there cases where they would want to suppress it?
That's hard to predict, especially if we give it to NuGet authors. So I would expect there to be cases where it is okay to suppress it.
So would this be if code is loading a type by name, because of layering or whatever, it can't take a strong reference to it, that if you were calling it, but you as something further downstream did have a strong reference to the thing it's loading, then the linker's not going to trim it out, so everything's going to work. I assume that would be when you would suppress it. It's like, as long as you keep this thing rooted, then everything will work. Or am I completely misunderstanding this scenario?
I think a better example is the serializer, which Michal talked about. So if the serializer takes the type names from random places, and so the linker can't figure out what they are, but in your specific scenario, you know that you're only going to get like 3 types, then you can root them yourself somehow else and then suppress the message knowing that, hey, this is fine.
Another use case that we were discussing and thinking about would be, for example, you have, let's say, some dependency injection framework, and this framework has different ways how to find the components, and one of the components is it just scans disk and assembly that holds random stuff. And kind of if you have trimming enabled, then there is no guarantee that the random stuff that it will find on disk will have all the dependencies available because linker didn't see that. So kind of the API that would do this scanning would be annotated as like, hey, please don't use me if you are trimming. But there might be another way how to initialize this BI container, and that way might be safe because, for example, you specify the types manually. And kind of that the message would be about that like, hey, you are using something that is not going to work, but here is another option that might work.
Okay, but this attribute is expected to be produced by humans, not by a tool, right?
Yes.
So is compiler services the right namespace for that?
Yeah, it should be moved to the other namespace, we put all the other linker related attributes. It's just like system diagnostics.
Code analysis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, we should probably take another pass at this, because if you have like, let's say 10 or 15 linker-related attributes, at some point we might want to have a namespace dedicated for just the linker. I think right now we're probably
These things aren't just the linker though. We kind of we're trying to make these attributes general purpose enough that it's not just linker specific.
That's fine. I mean, maybe linker is not the right name, but I'm saying maybe we should group them in some namespace if there is a sensible grouping. Because if you dump everything in code analysis, then eventually this will also have 100 items, right?
I actually wanted to ask you, like your proposal for the capabilities thing. That's very closely related to this, right? The attributes which you define there, the same argument would apply, right? I assume.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, so when it comes to grouping, we basically have two options for attributes. One of them is we can introduce a base type, so that when you're in the docs, you can send on the base type, and then the docs tell you here are the derived attributes. So they're somewhat logically grouped together, so that you don't have just a flat list of 100 elements, or it's namespaces, right? These are really the two primary mechanisms that we have. For nullable attributes, we ended up not using a base type because we said, well, the namespace only has like 2 types today. We will add 10 types to that. That's fine. They're effectively already grouped. Now, once we dump more and more stuff into that namespace, that argument will disappear, and eventually we will find ourselves with this, compiler service, this kind of namespace where you have 100 things in there, and then people will have a hard time finding the one that matters. And that's the only thing where I said maybe we should take a step back and say, we're adding all these attributes now. Maybe there is some sort of grouping that is a bit more granular than just code analysis, right? But it's very hard to do this as a piecemeal thing, right? Because if you only review one attribute at a time, it's hard to see the systemic, grouping or whatever. So maybe we should just approve them all, put them all in code analysis, and then may take another pass in like a few weeks when we actually have a lot of attributes in there, and then maybe shift them in some other namespaces.
I mean, another approach would be, this is specific about reflection, right? So a potential place for this attribute could be system reflection. Like, instead of grouping all these attributes together in one namespace, putting them with the component that they go with might make sense as well.
Yeah,
Well,
unfortunately,
I mean,
if the technology is large, that might not be easier, right? Like reflection already has also hundreds of things in there, and so
I mean, like looking at your capabilities API draft this proposal, like the requires registry capability attribute is in Microsoft Win32, right? It goes with the registry. So this is similar approach.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily saying we need to do it. All I'm saying is that when you have cross-cutting things like that, sometimes it's nice if the cross-cutting things are centralized, because when you're dealing with them, it's nice when you can read all about them, right? If you distribute them through all the namespaces, it gets very hard for somebody to get a view. I mean, again, like we can also just have a topic somewhere on MSDN that says, okay, here's all the steps you can take, and here's the 12 attributes and the 12 different namespaces that help you do that. That's also a mechanism to do it, right? It's just that generally speaking, discoverability of attributes is not necessarily amazing today already, but yeah, like I'm not having like the perfect solution right now. All I'm saying is that it seems we're dumping a bunch of this stuff now in a namespace, and that's always mildly concerning.
So should we like postpone it, like maybe approve this one and postpone the namespace decision when maybe your proposal for the capabilities goes through as well, which will introduce like many more attributes similar to this one?
Yeah, I would not block on this. I think again, like right now we're trying to make forward progress as fast as possible, so we approve things as they come in, right? But the problem with piecemeal thing is that larger organizational things like namespaces are harder to do. So yeah. I'm fine with postponing that and then take another step and say, okay, now we have these 12 things. Should we put them in different namespaces?
Yeah, since you've joined, are you taking the notes, Emo, or is that on me?
You're muted.
I tried to ask this in the chat, but nobody responded. So
Well, we were already streaming. I can't look at the chat.
Given the set of attribute usages there, should this also be on interface, property, event, and module?
Does interface make sense?
Well, but you can't say that an interface references unreferenced code. There's no implementation.
Except for dims, so yes.
Put it on the method.
Consistency.
Yeah. I guess really the question is, do we need it at the assembly and class and struct targets, or should it just be constructors and methods? Which is the inverse question.
Right now we know only about method use cases, but in the NuGet world, it might be much easier to like mark a whole big piece of the thing as problematic.
I mean, I can see this being, because interfaces, like in ASP.NET, a lot of the interfaces are effectively platform provided. If we ever try to do something smart with ASP.NET, then I can see that in the DI context, something we want to apply to interfaces as well.
Okay, so then if we're adding interfaces, then to go back to Tanner's question, should we add the higher level constructs over methods, so the events and properties? Or
I would generally say if you add assembly, I would almost always also add module. So, like, why not? Seems weird to omit that. And if you add class, I mean, seems reasonable to fit as well.
Basically everything except parameter, it sounds like.
I was about to ask, is there any target we don't want it on?
Yeah, I mean, delegate seems weird to, like...
Sure.
Like anything which doesn't have a capability to carry code with it, because this is like a statement about code, not about data. So generic parameters, fields.
If you're doing it from the perspective of what can carry code, then it needs to be on delegate, because delegate types are actually, they inherit from delegate and implement a custom invoke method, which on C# will never do it, but in IL can.
I think the invoke method needs to be runtime implemented. I don't think people can actually provide their own. But it's mostly associated with code. So even for property, I don't know, like, what that means. The getter and setter therefore require unreferenced code. Then kind of why not put it on the getter and setter?
It would be the same thing as for class. It would apply to all methods underneath that container.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same as putting it on the getter and the setter. It's just, fewer words on screen, which goes back to either, I think it's either that we say it only applies to methods and constructors, which are logically methods, or we put it on all of the things that can contain those. But the sort of like skipping the middle bits feels weird.
We could just go with methods and constructors for now. Like, I was thinking even for the assembly, like in those cases, maybe we will want to tag the whole NuGet package so that you can actually see it in the UI. And like, oh, I am linking, therefore I shouldn't be even able to use this NuGet package.
Right. I mean, on the one hand, I'll say, we could always add to it. It's easier to add than take away, but there would be some versioning things with the tooling of if you happen to be running an older linker that doesn't understand the assembly level attribute, then it won't produce the warning when somebody was using it assembly. So this does feel like, because it's essentially designed for consumption by an external thing, we get it right in the first version and can't change it, or can't sensibly change it. So I'm fine with either way. Just our normal, we can always grow this later is a little less applicable here, I think.
I don't fully understand the pushback of not putting it on class, properties, assembly. Like, it feels like if you have a library with 2 classes, 30 methods each that are all doing this, wouldn't you just want to slap it in one place and say this whole thing instead of having to put it on 60 different methods?
Could
That
you
was
just
the
put
reason.
it on the constructors?
Yeah, if it doesn't apply to statics, yes.
Yeah, like I'm currently copying in all the different attribute targets for the updated proposal. So I don't really care one way or the other. I think we just need to decide: are we turning it on for all of them or just the minimalist set? But part of what we say here determines how much work we have to do in the linker to detect those patterns, or whoever's producing the warning, because it'll need to look at all the proper scopes.
I think it's fine to include all the scopes, well, except the parameters themselves.
I mean, I wasn't. I mean, you just said exposing too much might not be, or exposing more stuff later might not be might not be possible. Why do you say that?
Well, there's just a versioning parity problem of if you had. So if in net 5 we produce a linker that understands how to read this only at method and constructor, and then in v6 we expand the attribute targets on this to say that it applies to anything that is a method or contains a method container, etc., then if you ran the net 5 linker against a thing using the net 6 attribute, it wouldn't respect that it applied at the assembly level, and it will link with no warning. Even though what you meant was for it to absolutely and totally give a warning.
Maybe I'm missing the thing with the linker, but usually that's not the way people do it, right? Usually people have the later tooling targeting older runtime, not using older tooling targeting later runtime. In fact, the SDK mostly blocks that anyway.
Fair enough. I don't. Yeah, I've never written one of these tools, so I don't know if they usually try tying themselves to a minimum version of object or anything. But I guess if this lives in the box, then there's not a NuGet chaining problem.
Yeah, I mean, I would generally not expect people to be able to use the .NET 5 linker on a .NET 6 app. That seems asking for trouble, because now we would have to what's compatible with between our tooling and our infrastructure, which we generally aren't. So that I mean, backwards compatibility is hard enough. Like, we can also take on forwards compatibility. So yeah, I mean, I think my general assumption would be, if we need to add more targets, we can do so later. So I'm honestly fine with saying, whatever the linker team is willing to tackle in this release, those are the things we expose. And if there's 5 more things that could be beneficial, but nobody implements them, I'm also finding there no legal targets, because the value of restricting the targets is just when people apply the attribute and something we don't understand, they get an error, rather than just not doing anything, right? So that's realistically the only thing we're doing here.
Right.
It is obviously easier to do it for less things, and especially like the big ones like assembly and module are kind of hard to detect, or harder to detect. So if you think we can upgrade it later, then doing just methods and constructors is a good start.
That was
I'll
easy.
just say one thing. It's so pleasant for me to see somebody else having to fuck with code in the text box, and not me this time. I like it.
Okay. I couldn't find anything that we had a simple URL parameter on. The closest was the upgraded obsolete attribute, which is URL format. I don't think that'll apply here, so do we have a good name for the URL property?
URL seems reasonable.
Fair enough.
And should it be type string or URI?
It needs to be string because it needs to be literal, right? Otherwise it can't apply.
Yeah, sorry, it's an attribute. It cannot be URI. You're right.
But even then, I mean, URIs are just pain in the ass. We almost always have overloads that take string as well because almost nobody has a URI and URI.
Any objections to the name? Sorry.
Go ahead, Mikhail.
Whether there are any objections to the name, because like with the name we have been iterating on this for a while. Like we called it linker, unfriendly attribute, and this. What is the best way to name this?
I mean, if the purpose of when you do this is that you're executing code without a strong reference, then it sounds like you're describing the symptom or the code behavior that you should apply this to. The fact that it produces a warning with a message is possibly going to get abused, but there is a clear purpose to it, so I think the name's okay.
I mean, what does this thing actually mean? It means every time I use this thing, I will get a warning in the linker that I have to do something else, and then I suppress it, or what's the intent?
Yeah, so every time there is a strong reference to something that is annotated this way, you will get a warning for the place that is making the reference. So, like it's calling into the world that is not compatible with linking.
Yeah, I think that's in that case. I think I like the name because it kind of says every time you get this, there's some other requirement that you have to fulfill. And I think it communicates.
It also shuts off the linker from complaining about inside the method annotated with this, which is kind of important too, because then users don't see warnings about internals of that method. So if that method's doing, type.getType, some string that it has no idea it's coming from, the end user doesn't want those warnings, right?
Yeah, that one is harder to describe in an attribute name because that's basically the behavior that most attributes have, right? Obsolete, like members marked obsolete can call other obsolete members, right? So that's kind of, it just is basically the logical fallout of avoiding cascading errors, right?
Yep. Right. Inherited, I'm assuming should be turned into false on here.
Yeah, I don't know what the default is, but what should be the behavior? Probably false, right? Yeah.
The default is true.
Then it should be false.
And allow multiple should be false as well, I assume?
Yeah.
No reason for two messages.
Right.
Yeah.
And that one defaults to false.
Yeah, you say that, but
may as well be explicit.
The doc says it, yeah.
The fact that none of us can ever remember this kind of means that
we did something wrong in 1.0.
All right. Anybody have anything else on this one?
For the name, I mean, the namespace, yeah, never mind.
Yeah, basically we said like, it's the best
this,
one
right?
we have, but like, yeah.
Oh, and then subnote, we may want to bulk move these.
Well, bulk review and move, right? But yeah. Linker inspired. I like that as a namespace.
All right.
You want to remove blocking as well while you're at it?
I hadn't on the others, but I can go back and do that, sure. I guess the other. All right. I'll do that in the background after we get context loaded for this one. So get GC info number 34648.
So I'm not sure whether Maoni joined because we tried it last week and then the linker stuff took all the time and she dropped off. Is Maoni on the call? No. Okay, then I think so. I read it briefly. My understanding is that it's basically just a bunch of data that the GC has that it's effectively exposing that. I think we had a similar API before where we basically ended up grouping things together so that you can get the data in an atomic fashion rather than getting independent properties, and then it's unclear. At the point where you're asking them, you might now get inconsistent data, right? If you get them all as one single GC info, then well, you know that this might still be a snapshot at time, but at least the data that you get is all correlated with each other, so you can make general computations where things add up in the way you expect them to. That's basically all I know. But
since we'll probably want to walk through each of these and understand what each means, maybe we should wait for someone who understands what each means.
Yeah, I mean, the question really is like, do we have any concerns about particular things? Because then we can just ask over email and not have to bring her in again.
Can you scroll down a little bit, Jeremy, or Emo, whoever's driving?
Jeremy was it.
I assume that amounts as a little bit.
Yep, I just wanted to see what was left. So this is really, the gc.getGCInfo already exists, right? And so does GCInfo. So this is adding these additional members to the GCInfo type.
We seem to have gc.getGCMemoryInfo, which...
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
It was that all of the stuff here is new.
Yeah, so GCMemoryInfo seems to be the top couple of properties up here.
So what's the difference between getGCInfo and getGCMemoryInfo?
So my understanding is that basically the memory info is more high level, and this one provides more detail. And basically people have asked for that, and that's why we're providing it. It's basically, as Maoni says, at the end of the day, it's a trade-off between simplicity and the amount of info you can get.
Yeah.
So like,
why wouldn't we add all this to GCMemoryInfo? Is it expensive to gather?
GCMemoryInfo currently is a struct, so this would be massively blowing out the size of a struct. I mean, we could make it a struct that wraps a class to reduce return value copy size, but that feels a little silly.
So this is basically saying we messed up with the API we previously exposed?
Well, since it contains 5 longs, it definitely exceeds 24 bytes. So, yes.
Let me rephrase. When we expose this, are we effectively obsoleting the other one?
so that's, I think, a question we should ask Maoni. Like, I think that, yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah,
the thing
I'd be
with
curious
GC
if there's a reason we would call the other one versus this. Like maybe the other one is more performant.
I mean, probably it
you
won't
could still make,
be producing, an array, or there are a couple of arrays in here. There may be other questions that the GC doesn't typically have at hand, so this may be more expensive to get, but
Maybe, although my understanding of usage of this, and I could be wrong, was that you'd call it like once a second. So allocating a 2 time span array once a second is not prohibitive.
right.
yeah, if you do this times per request, then maybe you're doing something wrong.
Yeah, like there are a bunch of things here that I would want to ask what the purpose is. Index, just what does that mean? How does somebody reason about it? We have compacted and then is concurrent, so it feels like we're a little inconsistent with whether or not we have a prefix on the booleans. Is concurrent only the last GC event, or is that the GC operating mode? So there's, I think, tiny little questions that we would probably have about each one of these. So I don't know, maybe we could do it over email, but it might be that we need to defer.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, while we edit, I would just bulk up the questions and send it to her. and then see like what the response is, right? And then maybe set up a dedicated time again. So I think the one question that we had is like, how does this relate to GC memory info? Is this being superseded or granted? I mean, the GC type today is fairly clean, right? There's very little API surface, and I think this proposal is pretty much doubling it, something like this. But so it might be worthwhile trying to think of whether we can keep it clean.
Other name value pairs or something might be more appropriate for something like this. I mean, if GC implementation changes over time, or there's different implementations, you know, a lot of these might not make sense, or there might be new ones that only apply in certain cases.
Maybe. I mean, I don't. Most of these look like they're things that have probably existed since the beginning of .NET.
Yeah, I mean, also, even if you would get rid of something, like worst case, let's say we remove finalizers, right? And then finalized object count would just become 0, that would also not be terrible, right? So I feel like this all, like, having this structure or this class, I don't think constrains ability to innovate in the GC.
Yeah. I know that we do generally prefer the signed types partly because of CLS compliance historical reasons, but do we think that there's I guess nobody has 63 bits of memory in their computers yet. Like, nobody even runs that many address lines. So maybe we don't need to shift all these to ulong just to avoid overflow problems.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, are you likely doing math with some of these things? Right? Because you do, then having them unsigned makes your life just harder.
Right.
Yeah, the ideal type for these things is going to be nuint, but that's kind of a pain to use, and long is just easier, even on 32-bit.
Yeah. Yeah. The fact that I don't think anybody really even exceeds like 53 bits of addressable memory right now means we still have a ways to go before we come back and like, oh, if only we had that last bit. So.
Yeah, but when you're working with addresses, you really want long or ulong, because that's what all of the arithmetic gets optimized around.
Sure.
Like, we have to convert it to unsigned for half of our math anyways, just to get the JIT to optimize it correctly.
But things like the finalizable object count, which should be named to finalizable instead of finalize, like that one's not going to hit. It's not going to pass 2 to the 63, and the pinned handles count isn't going to pass 2 to the 63. Promoted bytes, since these are totals and not addresses, I think that long is going to be sufficient.
What does index mean? Does anybody know?
I think it's literally the way I understand it is like the index of GCC seems to mean like a counter, like how many GCs have been performed.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's when you run this a minute later and the index has jumped by 30, then you realize, wow, we must be under high stress because the GC keeps kicking in.
But yeah, I agree that index is probably not the best name for that.
Yeah.
Pause duration should not have msec in the name.
Right, because it's returning time spans.
Good catch. Yeah, do we like these arrays? Because normally we don't like arrays like that.
Return a read-only span.
No?
I mean,
that might not be bad.
Since this is data that is just giving out, it seems okay. Like, turning it into any of the collection types feels wasteful, and the guidance for returning read-only span is it needs to be obvious to the caller what the lifetime management is of that span, and it's not obvious in this case, so it should not be span.
In this case, it would just be, I guess once you get an instance of this, if it returns the array, like the array is tied to the instance. If you mutate it, well, you mutate it. Don't do that.
Right. Like as long I guess that would be part of the question for Mayoni is if every time you call this you're getting a new array here, then it's fine as an array. If you're supposed to be getting a projection into some state that's only updated every couple hundred milliseconds, then it needs to be something else.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that I had kind of originally proposed read-only span, because it doesn't matter what the lifetime is, it's immutable once you get it. Like, as long as no one has a reference to it, it will eventually be GC'd if it's an instance member, and if it's a static member, well, great, it's shared amongst everybody.
Yeah, read-only collections is a better immutable because it's a lot harder to actually cheat and turn it into a pointer and overwrite something.
But if you're using unsafe code, I don't care at that point.
Yeah.
By read-only collection, you mean like I read-only list of time span, which could be an array underneath?
Well, or the type read-only collection.
The problem with interfaces is that you can cast them away, right? So that's why we generally don't use them to protect read-onlyness.
Yeah, and then the gen info shouldn't start with a lowercase letter and probably needs a better name. And is that a new type?
It is.
Yes,
it's the very top.
Presumably in the generation info, like, I guess maybe the argument is it's redundant with its index, but I don't know if it needs to identify which generation it thinks it is. But
yeah,
certainly it could be documented as generation info sub 0 is gen 0, etc. And since I hear you typing, I'm not doing any typing, Emo.
Yes, I'm typing.
Should the GC info class be sealed? If it's a class? Like, is there any reason for it to not be?
Yeah, I had commented on that in the issue. It should be sealed and have an internal constructor, because everything's get only. There's no reason for someone to instantiate this themselves.
I'm emphatically not saying anything.
Sorry, what was the question? I missed the question.
The type is not designed to be extensible, therefore it should be sealed and have an internal constructor. There's literally no reason for anyone to new one of these up. Every single property would be defaulted T.
Yeah, I personally would agree with that. I mean, the guidance is that we generally don't seal types, but at the same time, like things like this that are effectively exposing runtime state, I don't want to think about people extending this type. It seems
they can't, because they can't populate the properties. It would make no sense whatsoever for them to subclass it.
Right. I mean, the argument is usually you can put additional state on top of it, or you can wrap it or something, right? But I guess in this case you can't even do that because you can't populate the state.
Yeah, with no public or protected setters, it actually,
yeah,
there's nothing sensible you could do with extending it. So
yeah, we could design extensibility in the future if we wanted to, but I think that's a problem for 2021 us.
Well, that seems more like a problem of 6,000 BC, but 6,000.
Yeah. But the way that I tend to approach this is, if you seal it and make the constructor internal, you haven't screwed your future self over.
No.
I would, for the pause time percentage, I'd want to know what the average is, because if it's really small, then it might be better to return double here.
I could see that.
Can you compute this from the pause duration?
No, scroll down just a little bit, and there's another variable which is float, which is a percentage. And I would expect the pause percentage to generally be like a couple percent. And so depending on how this is represented, if it's between 0 and 1 or above, or if it's between 1 and 100 or various other bits, it might be better to return double instead.
In general, don't we prefer double over float anyway?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Most of our APIs default to double unless there's an explicit need for float.
And this it's not like this is gonna, this is not the thing taking up all the space in this type. So the extra 32 bits are fine.
We could even back it with a float if we really cared. So.
Indeed.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
By total elapsed time on that property, it means the total elapsed time of your whole process.
Where do you see that one?
In the comments for pause time percentage, it says it's calculated based on the pause durations and the total elapsed time.
I would think that it's because it gives you a percentage. It needs to be relative to the last time you called it, right? Otherwise, it's not very useful.
The last time from when I called get GC info.
That's what I would think. Yeah.
Based on the comment there, it sounds like it's as the longer your app keeps running, if you don't allocate more memory, this number just goes down. Because I guess it could be total elapsed time since last collection, but
yeah, I guess that's all fair questions.
Yeah. So what does that value mean? Because it may need more words in it to be more self-documenting.
Yeah. Do we like compacted? It seems a bit weird that you have compacted and then is concurrent. I would either have both of them is compacted is concurrent, or both is compacted and concurrent. Seems a bit mixing phrases.
I agree. I don't, because it's sort of snapshotted. Really, it feels like it based on and matching the comment. It wouldn't be is so much as was. So I would just get rid of the prefixes and have it be compacted and concurrent.
Yeah.
I would like a name like GC Snapshot versus GC Info. I mean, it seems like I know it wouldn't automatically update, but I mean, somebody could get the impression that it would.
It's not a bad idea, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, we already have GC memory info though, right? So I also want the name that kind of feels it consists in the same universe. And for the other one, we didn't go with snapshot, right? But it has the same semantics, right? It's a snapshot.
Yeah. All right. And Emo, did you get that finalize object count should be finalizable object count?
Yeah, so what I have right now is how does this relate to GC memory info? Is this being superseded? Can we, should we merge it? What is index? Finalizable object count should be finalizable object count. Pause duration msec should drop the msec suffix. Are the arrays of GC info allocated each time? Should GC generation info have an index property so that's more obvious rather than the position in the array? Is concurrent should be concurrent. GC info should be sealed. Pause time percentage should be double. Pause time percentage says it's based on elapsed time since process starts, since last time I called, or since last time GC occurred. And then gen info needs a better name, such as generations.
Yeah. Or generation info may also be fine. Like, same as the return type name minus the GC.
Yeah, it's just I don't like the plural, but yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I cheated.
That's fair.
Generation info seems weird.
I guess because you'd have GC info.generation sub 2, and that would look reasonable. So.
Yeah. All right. So then everything else.
Okay. So should I needs work this one?
Yeah, I tried to not annoy Melanie too much. So just post the questions and then just ask her to answer them, and then I would go from there.
So, okay, so do you want to just leave it as ready and we'll track it in your head that it's not?
Yeah, I mean, like, we basically want it to show up next time, right? So, like, I would just leave it as is right now and just post the questions, and I will just point her to the questions, and then once she has the answers, we can either approve it offline or just bring it up next time with her.
Okay. All right, Laomi, yeah. Extend default value handling in JSON serializer 35649er.
Nice. Okay, so there are a few scenarios that make up default value handling for the serializer. So one thing is ignoring default values. So for reference types, that will be null, and for value types, that will be default of T. So we currently have API to help us, to let us ignore null when serializing or deserializing. So the first scenario is to add API to allow us to do the same for value types. So the second scenario for FIVO priority is being able to pass null to custom converters. So I brought this up, I think it was a couple of weeks ago. We discussed the feature. I'll go over it again for people who weren't here before. But the general feedback from that one was, hey, there are some other scenarios involving default handling, such as populating property value with some default value if the type is the CLR default or the type is missing. So yeah, we can go over some of that feedback, but I just want to emphasize that these first two scenarios are the scenarios that take priority for FIVO, and then we can address the rest as FIVO backlog or feature. So API proposal, okay, here we go. So right now we have ignore null values, and I'm proposing to add a new Boolean property on JSON serialized options called ignore default values, which will be applied to both reference types and value types. So as far as I know, this was discussed initially for the serializers, but I guess the goal was to design the minimum thing that will be most useful for most people. But we've gotten feedback since then that people want to ignore default values for serialization and deserialization when, both globally and per property. So yeah, the proposal here is to obsolete ignore null values with the goal of removing it possibly in the next release of .NET 6 or whatever comes next, and then everybody should just use ignore default values instead. So it will be invalid for someone to set both of these properties right now. So if you can scroll down just a little bit. Okay, so there's an open question about what about people who want to ignore null values but include value type defaults. So in this proposal, we already have a JSON ignore with condition never. that you can set per property to force inclusion, regardless of what the global option is. So that's an option. We can come back to this some more. There's more discussion below that discusses alternatives if we deem that this is a major scenario we want to have a more convenient API for. Okay, so that's the default value handling scenario. Oh yeah, so the additional thing to do here is we currently have JSON ignored condition when null. So I'm proposing to rename that to when default. So per property, you can, if ignore default values is false globally, you can force a particular property to be ignored when it is the default value. And never would still mean, regardless of what the global option is, don't serialize don't ignore me. So that's all for ignore default values. So the next thing is, if you can scroll down a little bit. So option for custom converters to handle null. So currently, custom converters for reference types cannot handle null. We don't pass null on serialization or deserialization, which means that users are limited for handling null. Basically, there's no way to specify another value, even with a custom converter, which I think is a pretty bad limitation. And we've gotten some customer feedback saying that, hey, we need to be able to handle null. And an example is the Cosmos database. So they have I think I referenced this above. There's an example where they have a CRS class, which means coordinate reference system. And if the input JSON is null, we want to specify a singleton, well, not a singleton, but something else. I'm sorry, I'm hearing some noise. I'm not sure whether that's my end or.
It's being taken care of.
Okay. Okay, so Cosmos needs to be able to specify some other type when it is null. You can look at the example later if anybody's interested. Okay, so going down to some API usage examples, scrolling down just a little bit. So I just want to get through the whole picture before I take questions and discussion. So consider my class that has 3 properties. Excuse me, can everybody still hear me?
I got through 3 properties.
Yeah, okay, 3 properties. So a couple of value types and 1 reference type. Then another one where everything is initialized to some non-default value. So if you have ignore default values equals true, then you serialize this object, then it will be empty because you've specified to ignore default values. So, and the same thing with deserialization. So this time I'm deserializing the thing where every member is initialized and everything is set to default value. So all of those will be ignored because you said not to ignore default value. And by the way, so far, all of this is in keeping with Newton's soft behavior, including ignoring default values for deserializations for value types. So ignoring default values globally, but including some. So we have JSON ignore condition, never. So even if you specify globally that you want to ignore default values, you can cherry pick some not to ignore. So in this case, you serialize my bool because you said never ignore this property. So another example is handpicking properties to ignore when default. So if so this last one, ignore values should be false. We should no options. So that's a mistake in the example. But you want to say ignore this thing when it's ignore when it's a default value. So everything else gets serialized, but then this one isn't because you said to ignore it when it's default. So there's full flexibility with regards to ignoring or including default values. So there's some Cosmos scenario example that I referenced before. I didn't inline it here, but if someone it's pretty simple. The converter says, hey, I want to handle null, and then we pass null in the converter when serializing or serializing. So if anybody wants some visual example, we can scroll up and check that out. But otherwise, I'll just give the notes to say So the question about the custom converters handling null. So the question was, hey, we don't pass nulls to custom converters when the thing is missing. How would we be able to like account for that, and what would the API look like, and how would this interact with when you pass null to the custom converter? So I designed, I and like some others in JSON crews, Steve and David spent couple of hours discussing this. And the summary is that there's a proposed API we can add to account for that, and this feature will not be impacted negatively, or they wouldn't they will compose nicely is the summary. But I can go like in depth if this is required, or we can move on from this to. So if you go below, if you scroll just a little towards the bottom, then you can expand that, and then that has a whole ton of like API proposal that we can. I'm not proposing we add this immediately. I mean, I'll wait for more user feedback since nobody's asking for any of these things at this moment. But towards the end, I just leave a summary saying, hey, if we have semantics to replace or populate stuff when stuff is a CLR default value of missing, then we will set the value you specified, and we will not pass that to the converter. So, okay, so I'm going to, I'll take any questions, or if there's any discussion that we want to have.
Okay, so my concern is with the word default, because so I'm just curious: is there any feature on the radar which may have been one of those things behind the expander that I closed? Is there any feature that would allow someone with an attribute to specify a default is the only word I can use value for the property? So using attributes. Right.
Yes, there's a proposal to do that.
And is ignore default values going to include that value as the notion of default value, or does it always mean default of T?
The proposal will be for the default to replace the custom default to replace the CLR default. So if you say ignore default values, it will be that value that we're replacing, not the CLR default.
Okay.
There's some alternatives there. We can discuss it, but that's what this proposal primarily says.
So ignoring the complexity of how someone would express a default value for a complex type, ignore default values would mean if it's going to produce the value that you've declared in an attribute as the default, then don't write it down.
Don't write it down.
Yeah, to me, the serialization behavior is fairly easy to understand. I have a hard time with the deserialization behavior, because if I send you a payload where I say property equals 0, I don't understand why you would ignore that. And then, because I mean, like if I tell you like set this thing to 0 or set this thing to null, if the object happens to initialize itself to a different like non-CLR default value, then well, how will I ever do that then? Like it seems to me like people would like to have the behavior on serialization. I'm not sure they always want the behavior on deserialization.
Yeah, I mean that's considered one. I mean, and I think that's correct or right, that we can just apply the default value ignoring to deserialization when it's
yeah. What you just highlighted, like I find that extremely surprising.
I agree.
Like I would be shocked if people would look at this and say, yeah, that's exactly what I wanted.
Especially because on a Boolean like that, there's literally no way to get it to go to false.
Right. Okay, yeah, I will highlight it here. The other thing to note is that Newtonsoft has this behavior today, so this won't be surprising to people who are porting from Newtonsoft. Well, from correctness or expected point of view, then that makes sense to me.
Well, I mean, I would say that my suspicion is people probably don't protest because they don't initialize to non-standard values, right? So they probably never observed that behavior. Would be my guess. Like as Jeremy said, right now you can never ever set my bool to false. Like I don't think that's behavior anybody wants. Like that seems very backwards to me.
Right. Yeah, so we wouldn't. So if ignore default values wouldn't apply to deserialization if it's if it's applied for a struct type. But for null, we'll continue to deserialize null into properties that can be null.
I mean, like maybe, right? Maybe the point is you need more granularity here. That it's ignore default values on serialize, and then now you have ignore null values on deserialize and ignore default values on deserialize, and that those are maybe different things, or maybe not. Like all of the stuff gets very complicated very fast on the deserialize
All right,
side.
let me ask a different question. I understand why you would omit it on serialization because it makes the payload smaller. But if somebody went to the trouble of sending you an assignment, why would you not execute it? Like, I mean, you're not saving that much compute power, right?
Yeah, So we're still talking about deserializing struct values into, I mean, like zeros and falses, right? Why wouldn't you want to apply it?
Not just that, but also the MyString example that you have. If you have an incoming payload that explicitly says, I have a value for MyString, and that value is null, as opposed to just leaving MyString out entirely, why would you not call the property setter passing in null?
I mean, but that's already what we do today. If you do ignore default values, so that's a retrospective or retro. That's questioning what we've already done today.
Okay.
You might set a previous default value, like my string equals hello world, and not want new stuff to override it. The same could be said. There's an argument to be made for default
Like,
values as well.
If you want someone to not overwrite it, don't put a setter on it. Like that's the way you express that at a class level.
I guess that's fair.
So, like, if part of the thing that you want to do here is make ignore null values obsolete, you don't have to respect any of the same behaviors in ignore default values. It's a different setting. You're allowed to fix the mistakes of the past.
Yeah, I would say, like, to me, null and default is kind of different because you can argue that null almost always means an absence of a value, right? Versus false or the number 0 are not usually absent of set value, right? So I think it's also fair to say if you set something to null, the behavior of today you can probably defend more. But if I tell you set this bool to false and you drop it on the floor and initialize it to true, that seems more of a problem to me.
Okay, so if we have an alternative is to have a new ignore value default property and not obsolete ignore null. So if ignore value default is used, then I think that could specify that we could say that if this is set to true, then we wouldn't apply it for deserialization.
I mean, I would separate these two. Like, to me, it's like, okay, we have the behavior today that ignore null values basically doesn't execute the setter if the value is null. But I guess my question is that desirable behavior, or is that just behavior that just happens to work for people? Because I have a hard time coming up with examples where that is actually the behavior that I want. So, like, my gut feel is it's just behavior that we happen to have and nobody gets bitten by it, and so it's okay. But if we design this new thing to cover default values, I think, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, I don't think we need to offer a configuration where if you send the default value, whether that's null or the configured default value, that you don't want the setter to ever execute. I really have a hard time seeing that as a valid scenario.
I think the issue with JSON is that you have a lot of serializers that just do a dump serialization and dump out all of the values, whether it's 0 or null, and those are kind of the lack of, like you said earlier, they were never set and they represent a lack of a value. So I think that's the main scenario for not wanting to call the setter. It makes more sense for null, I think, but the same issue happens for primitive types as well.
I disagree. I mean, I can understand a serializer that doesn't understand ignoring defaults, and now it's expressing a bunch of defaults, but you have
I mean, basically,
you have no good
I
way
mean,
of letting someone say, I really want this string to be null. And
I mean, ignore strings for a moment, right? It basically means as soon as you turn this on, all your booleans are broken.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that seems very weird to me.
Why
Okay,
are
so
the things broken?
well,
Because
unless
you
you
can never
initialize
get-
them to false. But
I mean, but false is the default value, so why
no,
would
so
they
the example Laomi has here,
Oh,
this class initializes itself to true in the
I see.
default
So if
constructor.
somebody explicitly said it.
So
Sure.
you
But
literally cannot set that boolean to false.
Sure. Okay.
okay, so if the feeling is that we shouldn't be like we shouldn't ignore default values on deserialization, could that be the behavior for the new property?
Right, so I would call the new property ignore
And then-
default values on serialize. Or when
Right.
serializing.
We obsolete the previous one because now we're wondering why we're deserializing null. We're not deserializing null when null is not present in the payload.
Yeah, and then
People have 1 year to react to that. And then we can add a future option to say, hey, we can deserialize default values into properties if you want.
right, and then the new setting I would recommend it not involve deserialization in any way, shape, or form. You start doing null assignments to properties, but if they're using a custom converter, then you now you still have to defer to the do they handle null so that you don't crash them.
Yeah, I do think that the major people care about is for serialization to make the JSON smaller. So I mean, unless Steve has any objection to that's fine with me. So rename this to ignore default values on serialize or something shorter.
Right, because it feels weird to me that there would ever be a case where I want to say, don't invoke the setter based on content that is literally in the payload.
I mean, I think Steve did come up with a viable example of that, where you have somebody who is setting partial properties, and then you want to merge it into your existing object rather than overwrite everything in your existing object. And I can kind of see that, but I don't know how that other entity would ever be able to tell you, hey, I'm explicitly giving you 0 as opposed to giving you 0 as a default.
Right.
Like at that point, we now have what, myInt:0 bang.
Yeah, you would
and
need.
Now we're, yeah.
If it's for patch scenarios, like in a patch scenario, you want everything that's expressed to be set, and like I think that it means that you need a more complicated serializer to express. I didn't write this down because I'm okay with the default, and that's fine. That's part of the thing that you're trying to do with the future attribute of this is the default value for this property. Don't write it down if it's this. And so I think that's all serialization concern, and deserialization is always this was written, read it.
Yeah, in a certain way, you could argue that patching and defaults are not really compatible to begin with, right? Because like deserialization into brand new objects is well defined because you can say the default is assumed to be done by the constructor, right? And so, but then I don't have to set them. But if you patch an existing object, if my current object has the default value, then the other one may already have a different value, right? So who's to say that I don't want to set it back to my default value, right? So in that sense, patching to me implies you have to select what you want to patch, and then you have to set it to whatever the value you currently have, whether that's the default or not, right? Otherwise, it's, in my opinion, very weird to say I don't have to patch default values because you're patching a live instance. Who's to say that the value is the default?
Right.
Do we have a first-class concept of patching in the JSON serializer right now?
No, because we don't allow an instance to be specified.
I see. Because you could maybe argue that constructing an object, if it has set these properties to non-defaulted key values, is morally equivalent to taking in an object and then patching it. But I have a feeling that once we add first-class support for that, a lot of these scenarios will kind of fall out, and then we'll be able to reason about them more clearly.
Yeah, I think we should probably just touch bases with James quick too to see if he has some scenarios. I do know that perf is something that comes up with this as well, because calling setters is possibly. So if 90% of your values are defaults, it's, a lot more efficient, of course, not to call a setter. But
remember, calling the setter could have a side effect, though. Not calling the setter might be incorrect.
It's definitely correctness versus perf in this particular point.
Yeah.
Well, correctness versus perf is not normally a trade-off that we make. Like we generally say correctness is always overrides perf without exception.
Right. That's why I thought we should reach out to James just to see if this was a perf scenario for other serializers, or if there is some merit, some other scenarios that we haven't thought about.
Yeah, I can imagine some of these property setters might throw if you pass in null, and that totally makes sense as to why we would want to prevent that.
But when we get to the next part of this, that's something that someone can specify as a more directed thing, which we can talk about in a moment. But from the big switch on the serializer, I think that you should say that's only ignore default values when serializing.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I discussed yesterday with Naomi, because he basically asked me for feedback, is, I don't know how many of you have used the WinForms designer, but they have a very similar issue. Right? When you design a button in the UI, they don't want to just blindly take the entire object state and write it into the generated code. So what they have a similar thing. There's this component model attribute that you can apply, and you can say the default value of this property is whatever you can express as a literal. And then they also have the convention. You can define a method, and the method is basically should serialize and then the property name and returns a bool. So if you have a collection that has complicated state, you can express that the current state of that collection is the default. So don't serialize it. And so this way, basically, when you serialize the button into the generated code thing, it only has the thing that has actually been modified by the user, right? And so in that sense, I think thinking of this as a serialization tag to me makes sense. Because if you serialize something, that is the value that you should set. I think it's the easiest way to reason about it.
Should this option be ignore default values on serialization?
Yeah, I guess honestly, I think the name should serialize default values seems reasonable, right?
Oh, you would change it to from ignore to serialize and default it to true.
Yeah, this way or the other way, yeah.
Okay.
We try to keep all of the defaults to false. They are all false currently.
Yeah.
Right, because the note that I have right now is it should be renamed to ignore default values when serializing, which is long. If you invert the meaning and allow the default to be true, then serialized default values makes for a much more concise version of that name.
Yeah.
But
I mean, the thing with Booleans is, I don't like Booleans where the property name is already a negation, because then basically you have this double negation in your head that you have to deal with. So in this case, I think having a default value that is non-false is better than the alternative.
So you think serialized default values?
Yeah, I think it's easy to understand, but if you set this to false, what it does, then ignore to set to false. Right? Like, now you have to do the math in your head what that actually effectively means.
Okay. And Emo, what are our current rules on obsolete? Are we allowed to obsolete this property?
Yes. In general, obsoleting members is relatively unproblematic because only callers get it. Obsoleting types is more problematic because they leak through signatures and inheritance chains, and obsoleting a type usually means you get hundreds of warnings. So I think if you have a member, I would not push for putting a diagnostic ID on that. It seems over the top because it's just one member. You only get it for the call sides, and there should be not that many to begin with.
Okay.
So question based on this discussion, what should be the behavior of JSON ignore condition when default?
We're not there yet.
Okay, just to note that. this is an already existing API. It's called when null at this moment.
Right, because that's here that you wanted to rename that, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so, does anybody else have anything for the JSON serializer options before we start scrolling down?
I just want to say that by obsoleting that could potentially break some people that want to ignore value types. But there's a workaround, and that's applying the attribute everywhere.
Yep.
Well, obsoleting doesn't, like, the behavior is still going to stay there, right?
Yeah. I mean, when it's eventually removed, if it ever is.
Yeah, I mean, my gut feel is removal will probably not happen.
Why?
Because the problem. So there's two sides of the argument, right? Generally speaking, removing low-level APIs is impactful when people go forward and people migrate to the new thing. I think anything that actually writes data that people are very likely to persist somewhere, like for example Cosmos, when you actually write documents into a document DB, the implications of changing serialization behavior are pretty bad, because then you can basically no longer read or write your state that you have written years ago, right? And that one is even harder to reason about than just migrating from one .NET Core version to the other. So I would generally say the benefit of us removing this is very low. I would just obsolete it and then hide it and then move on with life, because there's very little that we gain by removing that. The only thing we gain is, like, having to explain to hundreds and thousands of customers what they have to do to get their old behavior back, right? Which they wouldn't be able to, right?
Especially because this ships in a NuGet package, which means someone could have built against it with an older version, and then they get forcibly upgraded at runtime with a newer version, and now they get a missing member exception, which is never nice.
Great.
We normally put the that attribute that turns things off for IntelliSense when we
editor browser will never, I mean, that's what I'm saying, and we get most of the benefit of obsoleting it and hiding it, right? So then also going out of your way to actually physically remove the API seems, I mean, maybe we can remove some lines of code in our product, but I don't think it will make our life significantly easier.
Right. So, are you saying we should make it editor browsable never in this version? Or do we want to wait a version for that?
I don't have an informed opinion on this yet.
I mean, if that means less people will use it, so we have less of a problem later. Because this is fairly new, I think, and the usage is like 0.1% on NuGet right now.
Yeah, I think obsoleting and hiding at the same time seems reasonable. I mean, the thing with hiding is, right, if somebody has to keep using it for whatever reason, then hiding just sucks, because you basically always have to type it out. But I mean, it's just a member, and it's also not something that you would call a lot, so I think it's okay if that's hidden.
Okay. So, JSON ignore condition.
So I heard rename. Is the proposal that we rename it, or the condition is new, right?
So previously we had when null, which meant regardless of global options, when this thing is null, ignore it on serialization and deserialization. So my intent was for this to be applied to both reference and value types, since we now have a concept of ignoring value types. So this would have meant ignore this thing if it is default on serialization and deserialization. So now the question is, like, when do we apply it on deserialization? Do we ever? Or like, should JSON ignore condition be restricted to just serialization?
I mean, if somebody's putting it on the specific attribute, then saying that you want to ignore the thing can be reasonable, but then you probably want to break it out into
like
when default serialize and when default serialize and deserialize, or
some enum saying like process like serialization operation, either serialize or deserialize or both, like a flag to say when to apply. So an enum flag to say when you want to apply this, the default would be one of serialization or deserialization or both.
I mean, if you had keep when default, and then maybe like when default on serialization, when default on deserialize, something like that, maybe.
Right. So when default will apply to both, when default on serialization will apply to serialization only,
and that could be fine. I don't have.
And then always and never always means always ignore this on serialization and deserialization, and never means never ignore it on serialization and deserialization. Okay.
So did you already ship JSON ignore condition?
Yeah, it shipped in preview 3.
But in 5, not in a stable build.
No, in 5, not 5.
Yeah. So like nobody, I don't care
so,
about different previews. That makes sense now. Okay, then I think renaming it to when default makes sense.
Right. So, so we want always when default, never when default serialize only, and when default deserialize only. Or I guess those serialize should be serialization. Or.
I mean, generally speaking, as I said before, like I just don't buy the deserialization. Like, I mean, serialization makes sense to me, but deserialization seems odd.
Yeah, I mean, I think that ignoring default values on deserialization is odd, but if it is something that someone is explicitly applying to a property, then that makes more sense to me than a global switch at the deserializer level. So I would be okay with it there as a concept, but it makes when default then be ambiguous. So that would be my real concern.
I see. You're saying when you apply the attribute and you say when default and it only means one side, that's weird.
Right. So if anyone thought that it would ever be feasible that we would want to ignore default values on deserialize, then we would really want that when default to be a tri-state. And I think Naomi suggested that may mean that we want this to be flags of when to ignore things, and so it would be default when serializing, default when deserializing, and then always and never. But that doesn't really feel like flags, because always isn't really the same thing as both when defaults.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think having the 3 default states makes sense to me on this, and always and never should apply to both.
I mean, technically we could add one in the future, right? And make more explicit if we wanted.
Right, but does when default apply to both serialization and deserialization? Because if it's serializing, if it's only respected from the serializer, because again, like what does it mean JSON ignore? Does JSON ignore always, if it's specified